All right, the live stream is preparing.
I hear a pin drop. All right, I think we're in.
Well, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us.
That was not I.
No, sorry, that was
Are you watching are you watching another event, Barbara?
That was the blade of grass, I think.
Oh, okay. I see. Welcome everybody. We're just giving it a few more minutes to allow some people to trickle in, and we will begin 5 minutes from 5:30. All right, should we begin?
Sure.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome. This is Emmy of Printed Matter. I used to say at Printed Matter, but these days I say of Printed Matter while we're all working remotely. I have the honor of introducing tonight's event. Tonight we are launching Moyra Davey's publication, I Confess, published by the great Dancing Foxes Press, to whom I'm thankful for ushering into existence such beautiful publications with Moyra, from Burn the Diaries to now I Confess. Tonight's event will be moderated by the artist and writer Pradeep Dalal, and will feature a discussion between Moyra, Cason Sharpe, and Dalie Giroux. We will be dropping links on the chat box as well as on YouTube for the audience. To learn more about and purchase tonight's featured publication, in addition to I Confess, publications by Pradeep and Cason are available via printed matter, as well as an edition by Moyra titled 3 Frames that's comprised of 3 stills from the film I Confess, on which the book is based. Some quick and necessary logistical notes is that members of the Zoom audience are all muted. This event is being recorded and will be available to watch on Printed Matter's YouTube channel by tomorrow. We welcome your comments in the chat section of both Zoom and YouTube. Questions will be read by myself and relayed to the presenters after the conversation. So please drop your questions throughout and we'll do our best to address them or combine similar questions. So without further ado, our moderator, Pradeep Dalal, is a Mumbai-born artist and writer based in New York. His work has been shown at Sala Diaz, San Antonio, the Elizabeth Foundation Project Space, here in New York, Callicoon Fine Arts, and Murray Guy. His photographs have been included in publications such as Blind Spot, Cabinet, Grey Room, and Rethinking Marxism. His gorgeous artist book, Bhopal MP from 2017, is available from Printed Matter and was excerpted in Chandigarh, is in India. And his essay, A Bifocal Frame of Reference, was published in Western Artists and India. Take it away, Pradeep.
Well, thank you very much, Emma, and welcome everyone. I wanted to thank Moyra and Barbara and Karen from Dancing Foxes Presses for inviting me. I too was thinking that we have somehow adapted so completely to this online universe that I had to nudge myself to remember what it would be like if we were at Printed Matter for this gathering, and a chance to kind of browse, discover new publications and meet friends, both inside and outside, spilling onto the street and walking to the subway and continuing conversations on the train. All of that's kind of not on the table. Like many of you, I voted early yesterday in Washington Heights, New York, and the super long line circling around the block, 3 lanes deep, including many elderly with walkers and canes waiting patiently for many hours in the rain, was intense, a reminder of the urgency and the fraught brittleness of this moment. I'm going to just begin right away. I Confess was published on the occasion of Moyra Davey's exhibition, The Faithful, currently on view at the National Gallery of Canada, Ottawa, curated by Andrea Cunard, who is in the audience with us today. The book is designed by Berlin-based Santiago da Silva, also in the audience, and published by the museum and Dancing Foxes Press, which also published Moyra's Les Godesses, Hemlock Forest in 2017. We have about an hour and 10 minutes for the discussion between Moyra, Dalie Giroux, Cason Sharpe, and myself. Moyra and Dalie will give short readings to get us started, and then hopefully, once we're midway, maybe they will read an excerpt again from Moyra's book. We will have 20 minutes for the Q&A, and I think Emma will walk us through that. I'm going to do a quick introduction of Moyra, Dalie, and Cason. So here is the briefest outline of Moyra's bio and exhibitions. Moyra was born in Toronto and studied at Concordia, UC San Diego, and the Whitney Independent Study Program. Recent solo shows include the ones at Gallery Book Holes in New York, Cologne, and Berlin, and at Experimenter in Kolkata, Bergen Kunsthalle, Momok in Vienna, Camden Arts Center in London, Art Institute of Chicago, ICA Philly, Tate Liverpool, Kunsthalle Basel, Fogg Art Museum at Harvard, and Murray Guy, among others. 2 shows opened just a few weeks ago, earlier this month. The Faithful at the National Gallery of Canada, which includes 54 photographs and 6 films, the highlight being Moyra's new film, I Confess. And the show is open till January 3rd. There are some nice installation shots and walkthroughs and an interview with Moyra on the museum website that gives us a sense of what we are missing by not being able to see the show. The second monographic show, titled Moyra Davey Lanak Obras Works, is at the Artium, the Basque Museum Center of Contemporary Art in Araba, Spain, and is open until March 7th, 2021. Dr. Dalie Giroux is a professor at the University of Ottawa School of Political Studies. Her research focuses on contemporary political theory, Indigenous political thought, subaltern studies, Quebec studies, and art and politics. She's published several books, and most recently, and you're going to have to forgive my English word translation of that, it's titled The Eye of the Master, Figures of the Quebec Colonial Imagination. Dalie is the subject of Moyra's book and film, and she also contributed an essay, Correspondences, Notes on the Art of Moyra Davey. I encourage you to also watch her lecture cited by Moyra in the film and in the book, and it's titled Repetition in Ruins, Notes on the Art of Radical Political Theorizing. It's available on YouTube. Cason Sharpe is a writer currently based in Toronto. His fiction and criticism has appeared in Canadian Art, C Magazine, and Guts Canadian Feminist Magazine, among others. His first collection of short stories, Our Lady of Perpetual Realness, was released in 2017. He's currently at work on a book of experimental criticism. He posts regularly in his newsletter titled, in this very cool way, I Know Right, ? And also check out the podcast, Two Hungry Children, that he records and produces with a friend of his called Kalale Dalton. The podcasts that I heard had the most amazing reggae and hip hop playlist with Barrington Levy, the Wailing Wailers, Cardinal Offishall, Lauryn Hill, and many more. A new book by Moyra Davey is a celebratory event. Many of us know her work and have seen it in exhibitions and through her beautiful and incisive books, from The Problem of Reading and the influential Long Life Coal White to Burn the Diaries, Hemlock Forest, and the most recent Index Cards. And now this book that we are celebrating today, I Confess. This project braids the lives and works of three writers, James Baldwin, the Québécois revolutionary Pierre Vallières, and the political philosopher Dalie Giroux. Moyra begins with Baldwin's 1962 novel, Another Country, and weaves in a personal chronicle of the 60s and 70s, a turbulent period of Québécois history marked by separatism and violence that remains unresolved today. Other characters also thread their way through, including lovely portraits of the horses Charlie, Cisco, and Goya. I'm hoping that this dense webbing of the personal and political in Moyra's book, film, and exhibition, I Confess, will be illuminated a little in our conversation. Please join me in welcoming Moyra, Dalie, and Cason. So Moyra, will you begin with?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Pradeep, for that wonderful introduction and for agreeing to do this in the first place. I was so delighted that that you said yes, and also big thank you to Dalie and to Cason for being willing to participate in the event. It's really a huge thrill to be with you. So I'm going to read the chapter or the segment or the fragment called Pierre Vallières, and it comes after, as Pradeep mentioned, the first part is about the novel, about James Baldwin's novel, and then there's a discussion of another Québécois writer, and then we come to Pierre Vallières. So I begin. In the wake of Raoul Peck's film, I Am Not Your Negro, many of us were reading Baldwin. I'd finished 3 of his books and was about to begin a 4th when I started to remember a political memoir from 1968 that I'd known about for decades but had never read, called Nègre Blanc d'Amérique by the Québécois writer Pierre Vallières. The title, translated into English, makes use of the N-word, and Vallières was often called upon to justify his use of the offending word, but he stood by it. He believed the Québécois were also les damnés de la terre, the wretched of the earth. Later, Vallières would embrace and champion the cause of First Nations peoples, the original colonized populations of what would become a doubly colonized land. And here I'll just show you, there's photographs on every spread, and they're all stills from I Confess. My Montreal friends would often refer to themselves as a colonized people, and I knew from elementary school history of the pivotal defeat of the French on the Plains of Abraham in 1759. But my knowledge of politics stopped there with Benjamin West's giant arresting tableau of a dying man in a blood-red tunic and a kneeling, tattooed Delaware warrior. That famous neoclassical painting lives in the National Gallery in Ottawa, the city where I spent my teenage years. It is an iconic image signaling the start of centuries of colonization of the French by English Canadians in cahoots with the Roman Catholic Church and American business interests. So here you see the photos. Another strong memory from those years, wandering around the nearly empty National Gallery, aged 12 or 13, taking in Joyce Wieland's retrospective exhibition, True Patriot Love, with its signature quilt, Reason Over Passion, a riposte to then Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. I ordered Nègre Blanc d'Amérique and read most of it in non-chronological order, starting with the chapter on Vallières' childhood in Montreal, lived under the iron-fisted yoke of medieval Catholicism and the corrupt regime of Quebec's premier, Maurice Duplessis, whose grip on power lasted decades. Pierre Vallières is a precocious kid who sees from the cardboard walls of his ghetto home the extent of the church's hypocrisy and collusion with English Canada and American big business, a triumvirate that would conspire for centuries to keep the Québécois docile and submissive. And there's the photo spread. Vallières reads history and philosophy and tries to rally his parents to his dawning conviction about the exploitation of Quebec's working class and farmers. His mother is pious and disparages her son's growing disaffection. She wants him to quit high school and get a job in a bank. Être un esclave en chemise blanche, je préfère crever de faim. Be a slave in a white shirt, I'd rather starve, he says. His father is more open, but ultimately too beaten down by the graveyard shift he's been working for decades at the rail yard. The writing in this chapter is sublime. Vallières is a tormented soul searching for answers to existential questions via philosophy, literature, and theology. Photographs. Reading the memoir, I'm reminded of many expressions I used to know. The great darkness, the white dust of winter, the quiet revolution. When I hear a strong Québécois accent on the sidewalks of New York, I wince and I feel implicated. I went to school with French kids in Montreal, and I squirmed alongside them in the incense-choked church that adjoined the school and the presbytery. These buildings, plus a fourth called Le Manoir, stood like chess pieces, king, queen, bishop, rook, on a rise that dominated the neighborhood. Even at a young age, I was embarrassed by my parents' faith and dreamt of going to a secular English school where I'd be spared the stigma of religion and the bullying that came with being part of a disliked Anglo minority. Catholicism scared the shit out of me, as it did pretty much everyone in Quebec by design. Colonized, oppressed populations usually have accents deemed inferior. Maybe it's hard to see, maybe it's not worth it. I'm gonna sneak in one tiny last bit here because I think it kind of ties in Baldwin with Vallières. So the section is titled James Baldwin, it's very short. James Baldwin was a child preacher. It was a way to evade the violence of the streets and a form of protection against an abusive father. Like Pierre Vallières, he embraced religion as a means to salvation, only to later recognize its hypocrisy and vehemently repudiate it. Baldwin once said, quote, "I really mean there was no love in the church. It was a mask for hatred and self-hatred and despair," unquote. All right, so I'll stop there.
Okay. Dalie?
Yes. I'm delighted to be with you all today. It's a treat, really, and especially you, Moyra. I'm very, very glad that we can meet again, although remotely. The excerpt I will read is from the translation of my piece in the book. The original is in French, and I will read the first paragraphs where I'm trying to characterize the epistemology of Moyra's heart. Correspondence is about connections between things, points of convergence, the vast and indeterminate class of things that relate together to something, to a form, to a theme, to a contact. The connections between things are sometimes intentional, as when two people correspond, or they may emerge the result of coincidence or mimetism, whether conscious or unconscious. Throughout the history of living things, connections have been avidly sought, both for affective reasons and as a form of knowledge. It strikes me that Moyra Davey seeks correspondences in her photoliterary work, but subtly, the psychoanalytic layer never far beneath the surface. Correspondences, what might be called the art of making connections, operate in her multimedia work through resonance, through memory, through contiguity, a dogged, unassuming inquiry into what is there, what there is. It's a matter of questioning, seducing, encouraging everything seen by a body in a place, a practice of vital resonance. For Moyra Davey, research and life interweave, a variant of the art of divination that is art in its most archaic sense, forces, limits, affective structures, mirrorings, the self as a holographic fragment. I quote Moyra, "There's a narration and I became the delivery system for it," unquote. And onto-electric tension sizzles and conjures phenomenological space and time. The surpassing of the photographic medium passes through Moyra Davey's work via a surpassing of the medium through which the artist becomes medium. For it's not really autofiction and it's certainly not exhibitionism. It's not quite Moyra Davey either. It's more the trace of an intuitive experimentation with a form of knowledge that involves biting deep into the real, that requires unusual courage, and that maintains an extremely risky state of self-awareness, a form of knowledge that originates entirely with the living body on earth, defenseless, innocent, faithful.
Thank you. Cason, do you want to comment or should I ask a question?
Yeah, I can start us off. Thank you so much, everyone, for having me. Moyra, your work has been super inspirational to me. And so this is, I promised myself I wouldn't be too much of a fanboy, but I'm sure. One thing that struck me in both of the passages that you both read is the kind of circular nature of the work and how that circularity is really cross-temporal. So there's work here from decades ago infused with new work, and that kind of reaching across time creates these new resonances. And I was struck how you read Vallières in non-chronological order, and that really struck me because the work is presented in non-chronological order as well. So there's something about like fudging with the chronology that seems to be important to how we're framing this conversation. And I think there's like a political implication there too, because the kind of conversations that are taken up in this work in particular are these kind of circular and cross-temporal conversations. So I don't know if you guys heard of this controversy with the University of Ottawa professor recently. For those who don't know, University of Ottawa professor was using the N-word and it was justified or under like this idea of academic freedom, and it was taken up by La Presse, by an opinion columnist in La Presse in Quebec. And so it was interesting to have that controversy happen almost on the same day that Dancing Foxes sent me this book and I received it in the mail. It was this happenstance that was almost similar to your happenstance of coming across another country when you did. And so I guess I don't have a solid question here, but I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts about the circularity of this work in particular.
Yeah, Dalie, do you want to start, or how should we?
On the circular aspect, sure. The way I think of it is with the notion of repetition. And we've talked about this with Pradeep in preparing this conversation. Moyra explores or uses repetition in her work. I would even say it's a major theme, or better, it's a device. If you think of series like The Pennies or The Empties or The Newsstands, or even the writer in the subway, there's this device of repeating, and obviously the difference in repetition is always striking and moving and often imbued with a certain nostalgia, and we are delighted and comforted by the infinite variations of traces and alterations and marks and signs of wear that make which is repeated always singular. And in my own exploration of language, studying political thought in all its forms, be it ideas, discourses, writing, speech, newsreel, the social media constant secretion, I give a lot of attention to this notion of repetition. And the way I see it is that most of the time, most of what we think or say or write, what is expressed, is something that we actually repeat. We hear and we read things, and then we say them and we write them. The substance of thinking, of communicating, of building reality is repetition. And that is made truer by the fact that the texture of mass culture, its reality, is the realm of the repeated, where everyday objects come in series, lifestyles come in series, ideas and politicians come in series, and it creates sorts of an ontological loop. And I think Moyra's work is kind of piercing this repetition, this ontological loop at the art, playing with space and time. And I think Moyra's art is a way to survive repetition and a way to make something out of it by embracing what presents itself in its bare manifestation, and cultivating the magical quality of reality in the constant act of nurturing connections. Maybe I'd say something later on about the U-Ottawa controversy, which I was in the middle of, as you can imagine, working at the university.
I actually didn't hear about that one. I heard about one at Concordia, a similar controversy. I didn't realize there was a second one at the University of Ottawa. I'll just, one of the ways that I came to Dalie's work was through this incredible video called Repetition and Ruins. And it's a very, very performative work. It's, she's in front of a green board, a blackboard, but it's green, and she has chalk and she has an eraser, and she's talking about all of these ideas, many of them philosophical, many of them, just very concrete about how we have to pay to live. We pay to be born, we pay to get an education, we have to constantly be paying, and paying to die, and this idea that we don't want to be producing value. We want to live. We want to be living. And but even, I have to say, even before any of the ideas really sunk in, because it's very heady stuff, what she's talking about. It was her affect that really really spoke to me. It was her way of moving, her way of speaking, her way of thinking and speaking, and these unbelievable diagrams that she draws on the board. They're so artful. I tried to reproduce some of them, and some of them show up in the film and even in the book a little bit. Then she just erases the whole board and they're gone, and she starts again, and they're an incredible, it's a very, very engrossing performance, and it figures in the film. I confess, I have it playing on monitors, and you see her, I encourage all of you to watch it. It's really a fantastic piece.
Moyra, can I ask you a question just in terms of Dalie's idea of repetition? Like, what is in the exhibition and what we've seen of the works are these large groupings, right? The 150 and the dime, the Lincoln pennies, 75 and the subway portrait. So there is spatially in the exhibitions, you are able to see that repetition from a very small unit, and the photographs themselves are relatively modest. but there's an accumulation of that density of thought that then you see, and then visually you can sense the slight green of the copper or the brown, all of that. But in the book, how does the repetition work, or where is it coming? So I wanted to just kind of sense your understanding of when you produce the thing in the book, then what exactly is going on there? Like, how do you?
Yeah, I mean, the book is actually quite a unique project. It's officially it's a catalog for the survey show at the National Gallery in Ottawa, but in fact, it's it's a bit of both. It's a bit catalog, and I think it's a lot artist book actually. And so it's really picking up on very new themes, on projects that are very recent. You know, the film that I just completed, and then even these very, very recent black and white photographs of animals that I made, of chickens and horses, and you know, here you can see the chickens. So, I mean, this actually started when I was in Ottawa installing the show. I went to visit Dalie in Quebec. She lives, you know, in La Pêche, which is just not too far from Ottawa, across the river. And I had this idea. I had this thought that I was going to make a portrait of her, but I was kind of uncomfortable with the idea. Dalie was kind of uncomfortable. So I ended up making kind of portraits of her chickens and her dog. And we went to visit her neighbor, John Eaton, who is a painter and has this magnificent Percheron workhorse named Goya. And I photographed him, and I photographed Goya. And then there are other horses in here, because as I was installing the show and making these animal portraits, I was also curating a Peter Hujar show for Buchholz in Berlin. And I was consciously trying to channel his animal portraits, which are so incredible. And so there's photographs, you know, my kind of feeble attempts to do that in these photographs of horses. So, you know, the book is almost everything in this book is very, very new and recent, even though it also harks back to the past. It harks back to, well, in the case of, I confess, to 1980, when I met Pierre Vallières and I photographed him. And I had 2 or 3 rolls I had contact sheets, but I had only ever printed one photograph of some kids from those rolls of film. But I made all these portraits of him. And so I printed them for the first time. And but then I also had this idea that's not very easy to articulate, because it's a very intuitive idea. And it actually came from looking at Marc, you know, I've always been a huge fan of Marc Morisseau's photographs, where he drew and painted in the margins of his photographs. So the idea kind of came from that. I wanted to put these little kind of gargoyle, you know, animals in the margins. And it was, I don't know, it was a way of wanting to sort of bring the past and the present together somehow. The past of these photographs and the past of my encounter with Pierre Vallières, with these little animals that I see as kind of, like gargoyle-like, almost like this. Here's sort of a good example, if you can see it. And you know, honestly, it's this whole piece is kind of a form of magical thinking. but it's in the show, it's in the book. I think it's a bit of a risk, you know, that we took to, you know, foreground this piece so prominently in the book. But I don't know, we'll see, time will tell. Yeah, so I don't even know where I started with all this, but with repetition and I guess with uniqueness. This is like, I'm not repeating the copperheads and the subway photographs, and I'm you know, there's more of yeah, I'm sort of trying something new with this book, and it's kind of what I hope to do with every book, you know, to have it be as new and fresh and risky as possible, to, you know, to really yeah, to kind of wager that with every book. And I'm really happy with it. And with what the designer Santiago de Silva did with it also, I think he made many of the decisions in this book, and I think they were absolutely brilliant. It was his idea to pull out stills from, I confess, from the film, and to have them, you know, have the stills running through my essay, so that it's you know, you kind of get a little bit of a sense of the film as you're reading the essay. So, yeah.
Okay. But just quickly, there is an aspect of the film script, right? Like Dalie's text in French is a transcription of the film.
Yes,
so it
absolutely.
is operating on all these different filmic registers as well. The stills from the film become the cover image transfers. So that's kind of really interesting. I feel there's testing and trying new ideas, both technically, formally, you know, with the overprinting that you have, the release printing of the elements, right?
So in the film, I perform a narration, and then I meet up with Dalie, and we have a conversation, and she talks extemporaneously about Pierre Vallières. And then we also have another discussion via Skype. And so all of her words from those conversations are in the book, but they don't, they actually come after my essay, my narration, which is quite short. And they're paired up with the animal photographs, which I think is really lovely. So there are many voices, and then there's Dalie's essay, and then there's Andrea Cunard's essay, which is you know, very much about photography and antecedents in photography, and these images that we pulled out of the collection, the archive at the National Gallery, and are also in the show. Notably, a Robert Frank photograph that Dalie speaks about in her lecture, Repetition and Ruins, and has an absolutely wonderful thought that she expresses about it. And we transcribed that, and it's in the exhibition under the Robert Frank photograph.
Cason, do you want to say anything about the artist book?
Yeah, well, I think what I found so compelling about this object is, like, a book by its nature is a finite object, like it's complete, it's finished, but this one isn't in a lot of ways. I think, like, as we've spoken about, the repetition and the circularity of the work lends itself to, like, an unresolved that it can be continued. So, like, it was interesting. It was an interesting experience reading and engaging with this book, because I feel like it could continue. There's so much. There's so much there to be continued to be explored. And I think it was one of the moments right at the end in Dalie's essay when she mentioned how you were talking about taking pictures of these horses and how you weren't quite sure what you were doing with it, but you felt compelled to do it. And that kind of intuitive experimentation, as Dalie articulated it, I think it makes this book really feel alive. It feels like there's something there still growing.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Can I ask both of you just to speak a little bit, Dalie and Cason, about Vallières and the kind of understanding of Vallières and Baldwin today in your context, and if there is another kind of reading than we might have here? Or...
Yes. Pierre Vallières' life and works, well, it certainly has have a historical relevance. It's been associated with the Front de Libération du Québec, a militant underground organization of the 60s that resorted to holdups and bombs and manifestos to fight against exploitation, dispossession, and the lack of political freedom of the French Canadian working class. And Vallières wrote his first and most famous book while incarcerated in the Tombs in New York, where he fraternized with Stokely Carmichael and where he got to learn about the African-American civil rights struggles, which he somewhat misappropriated when he compared or equaled the French-Canadian economic exploitation with the Black slavery in America. Anyhow, the book was a central piece in the conviction of Vallières for murder and sedition in Canada, accusations for which he has been given a life sentence. Politically, I think this is the past, but I'd like to say that, and it's something that I came to rediscover with working with Moyra, is that Vallières has a literary and biographical relevance today. Perhaps like James Baldwin, whom Moyra associated him with. Vallières at a very young age has borrowed the essay memoir form of writing to assess the reality of political, racial, gendered, class violence in one's life and intimacy. He had this kinesthetic resistance to the order of things, to the norms, to dominant society. He shows this pride and quest of the marginals. He has this constant urge to act and create that so many of the writers Moyra convey in her work as. And I think Vallières was beautifully vulnerable, a tortured queer man who have had kind of a jagged trajectory. His mother never visited him in prison, and I feel for him, I really do.
Yeah, I think I came to Vallières kind of lopsided. I'm from Toronto, but moved to Montreal as a student, and was studying his work, and was kind of, I think the tension that Vallières kind of catalyzed for me. It wasn't directly about his work, but the idea of drawing that comparison between working class Québécois subjugation and Black slavery, and meeting Black people in Quebec, and how that dimension kind of erases a history of Blackness within Quebec, and reconciling that as an Anglophone Black person. So having discussions with Black Québécois people, and realizing that there's this resonance between Black Canadians across the country in the way that the situation that Black Canadians face is constantly compared to the States, but is a different idea, and then like there's a different dimension to it, just in terms of how like the transatlantic slave trade worked, and how colonization worked, and how migration patterns have worked, and then Black Québécois people are like a specific subset within that. So Vallières' work was almost a point of connection for me with a lot of Black Québécois people who I was meeting when I was there, who I felt a certain degree of alienation from, and I think felt a certain resistance or alienation towards me as an Anglophone Black person. And so it's interesting how his work has been taken up within Black Canadian contexts in various ways, has been really fascinating to me.
Dalie, I quickly wanted to ask you that question that I mentioned to you once, that apart from the idea of the biography and literary qualities, I'm also trying to ask, like Moyra in the text on Vallières mentions that episode where she writes about the idea, she says, I thought it was a joke and started to laugh when he said they were serving hot dogs for supper. And he simply said in the English translation, we try to live as best as we can. That is perhaps modest and inconsequential, yet it stayed with me. So the place of a personal exchange, a telling detail, sharply observed and narrated unflinchingly, that this can help build some kind of connective tissue within the larger, more abstract political forces. So just how is that negotiation between the personal, the individually experienced situation, and then the larger frame?
The hot dog tensor. This is a very fine inflection where the personal and the political intersect. The confession, Moyra's confession, the shame, the mirrored shame of laughing at eating hot dogs and of eating hot dogs. All this is the attention to the affective scene that makes the hot dog a social class tensor where power relations outcrop at the surface of things. This is very much Moyra Davey to me, and this is why our photographic art cannot do without literature.
I know it's a memory that stayed with me, and the exact, his exact response. That wasn't, so it's like 40 years. I remember, exactly what he said, but I think it's like one of these examples of, like, just like from the particular to the universal or whatever, like these little details that, that kind of, speak volley, they translate, when it's like these very, very particular details that people remember. They have, it's the grain of truth, I think, that they contain that is what translates to, a broader audience, a readership, or a viewership, or whatever.
And you're so brave, and you're a writer.
Thank you.
It reminded me of this one other moment when you were talking about your neighbor, Anne, and there's this one sentence that Anne is mercurial, snobbish, and quick to judge and express anger. And I thought it was interesting, there's no comma there, so it could be read as quick to judge and express anger, but also quick to, like, there's multiple readings in there. Quick to judge expressions of anger, or quick to anger, or quick to judge. And I thought that was such a emblematic reading of kind of Canadian relations in general. There's a quickness to judge, a quickness to express anger, but then also a quickness to judge our expressions of anger. And so it was like this personal moment, but could be read in such a broader context, especially within the way that it's framed in the book.
I'll have to reread that sentence because I'm sure you're right. It didn't occur to me that it could be, that read, understood in all these different ways. But no, I know the Canadian psyche is really particular, and I'm sure there is not just one Canadian psyche, but there are many. And I mean, I lived in Canada until I was 27, and I was part of the so-called art world, and there was definitely there was a psyche there that was very 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 particular, and I think everything that you just said could probably be applied to that milieu.
Moyra, I wanted to ask one thing, which was, in the text that you read out, you speak of Baldwin's prose and then say that ever longer passages of pure, gorgeous description and by an ever deepening complexity of the characters. And yet I was struck by how spare, precise, and analytical the text is in the book. And I was wondering that there's nothing extra in that, so there's a kind of, again, the weight of each of the paragraphs or the sections is kind of different from your previous books, from Long Life or Hemlock. And then I was trying to understand if the gorgeous description you speak of in Baldwin's writing is actually in the images, like the chromatic page edges of turquoise and carmine. So I just wondered if there is that kind of shifting in the way that you navigate the two vocabularies.
Yeah. No, it's true that my own text is really terse. It's it's quite short. But I was delighted by the object. They were these little pocket books from the 50s that my partner Jason brought home. And and the page edges were tinted, but it was also, I was in a bit of a reading funk when these books appeared. I'd been reading this book by this French writer Emmanuel Carrère about his conversion to Catholicism. God knows why it was recommended to me, but it was really depressing me, and I really need books, and so these Baldwin books showed up at just the right moment, and it was just an incredible relief to be reading fiction as opposed to this nonfiction memoir, but I had honestly, I had all kinds of feelings about another country, and I described some of them. At first it was like, I totally welcomed this prose, and I just dove into it, and it was exactly what I needed to be reading right then and there. But then, there were certain things about it that there's violence towards women in it, and I started to have doubts about it. But it's interesting, so I started to write about this, about the kind of back and forth that I had in relation to reading him, embracing him, and then kind of pulling back, and then coming back to him once again, and then kind of totally embracing him at that point. And that's when I started to write about him. But of course I had huge doubts about that. And I wrote to my friend Allison in Paris, and I sent her, some of what I'd been writing. And she said, I don't know if I can continue with this writing. actually. And she said this very interesting thing. She said, I think any writer would be happy to know that someone was reading them and having this kind of this whole thought process around their work, this coming in close and then taking distance and then finally just diving in. And that's what I thought I was going to be writing about Baldwin for this piece. But then I, because I was thinking so much about decolonization, I began to think about Pierre Vallières' book and how colonization and decolonization are understood in Quebec and in Canada. And that was the rabbit hole that, I ended up in Quebec. And that's where I stayed for the whole of the piece. I come back to Baldwin a little bit.
Okay. I think we're nearing, our cutoff. Maybe we have 10 minutes probably. So Dalie and Cason, are there questions or thoughts that you want to ask? Or Dalie, I know you wanted to read another piece with the Audre Lorde and James Baldwin exchange, or whatever.
Maybe I just want to quickly react to what Moyra just said, saying
Perfect,
that if you think of colonization and decolonization in Canada, it's a rabbit hole where you end up in Quebec, and I think this is interesting because a lot happened in Quebec. A lot of the initial structure of colonization and of the hurt and of the people that were there and that are here now is happening in Quebec. I think it's a lens or a prism of something very charged in North America. And I think that there is still a lot of inquiring and work and art to do around that and to dive into Quebec history, not Quebec history as French Canadians people's history, but as this constricted, paradoxical place where so many current meets. I think what Moyra did with I Confess and with the book and the exhibition is it feels like almost she's an oracle. I mean, she has this sense of putting her finger on things. She's not sure what it is. She just follows forces and tracks and delve into memory. But it's very uncanny that as we speak right now, I Confess is playing in a loop in a room in the National Gallery, while on the other side of the street at the University of Ottawa, we have this whole raging debate and controversy around the use of the N-word as a pedagogical device in class. There's a lot of almost a prescience in Moyra's intuitions and in her method. I think her method as a way of knowing is very valid, and those correspondences I'm talking about are very real, and as Cason said, it feels like it's living. It's a living work because it's lived, because we're all in there. We're all in the work, and it's going on. So it speaks to us in a very, very live, very personal, and very connected manner.
And it's also the 50th anniversary of the October crisis.
Right.
Which is, another, the show was supposed to open in April, and it opened in October.
Yeah.
Right.
Cason, anything to add?
Well, I think I was also just thinking about, to kind of on Dalie's point as well, like James Baldwin is this diasporic writer. Like he's known as being the expat American writer, kind of one of the quintessential ones. And a lot of his work creates this cross-national resonance. And I think what's interesting about this is, about I Confess, is that it does a similar thing where it is particularly located in a certain like national or regional context, but it also speaks to these like diasporic and migratory issues that are cross-national. And I think that like, it's one of those cases of like content-informed meeting where it's discussing these issues that are inherently diasporic in an inherently diasporic way.
Terrific. I mean, that is a way of thinking I hadn't kind of understood. Let me just see, Barbara, Barbara says we can continue for another 10 minutes because the questions haven't rolled in. But can I, for a quick second, I think, Dalie, when you mentioned the idea of Moyra's method and this pursuing down the rabbit hole, I wanted to kind of understand from Moyra a little more about this intensity, the whole idea that she kind of redrew your diagrams to kind of get deeper into the thought process. So reading and writing is one part, but then there is the other part of like the Peter Hujar format frame idea, and then it's kind of worked. In the previous film, she recreates that shot from Chantal Ackerman. So I was just trying to kind of get a better handle on what that might mean, because the method is not something as straightforward as we may imagine it. I mean, there is a kind of an intensity of pursuit and then using everything in the arsenal to get at it. The photographic, the filmic, the reading, the pursuit of these language differences like you saw in the film. You know, these books are in French by Aki and, you know, the French-Canadian writers. So it's across languages. So that kind of fluidity of maneuvering and pursuit is something I was just trying to understand better.
Yeah, using everything in the arsenal, you say. I'm trained as a political scientist and philosopher, which means that the tools and frames of reference I can use to explore or to contribute to knowledge, if I am to maintain some level of credibility, are narrowly defined. And I find that social sciences and more broader humanities are a quasi dried up source of orientation in the world because of kind of an instituted aversion to poetic operators and to authentic subjective experimentation. And this is why I think that Moyra's work in this world we are in, blocked up, saturated with power and sucking upon crisis. This kind of art, as Moyra defines it in her practice, is a high form of knowledge. It is subjective, it is empirical, it is an inquiry. It dares to bring into dialogues elements that don't belong together. It is writing and filming and photography and conversations and all of the arsenal, and it's about being right here, right now, and carrying no prejudice, holding nothing, and it's the gift of intelligence, and this is so because it's a gift. It comes as a gift, and I find that it's both art and knowledge and community making. And I think the carrying no prejudice part is extremely precious and rare and important. I Confess is an impossible movie to make. It's an impossible movie to make in the current state of collective thinking. And there you are, it's there. And it is knowledge in a very, it's knowledge that you can have no use for. It really is a gift of intelligence.
Wow. Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, I channel I channel you a lot in I Confess, and I do it in all these different ways. I do it, by, being in conversation directly, and I do it by trying to understand your lecture, and by, reproducing the diagrams, and making these montages in the film where I have the diagrams and I put photographs on top, and so I kind of create these layers. But there's definitely a channeling going on, which is really part of my method. And I try and be as, I have to be respectful if that's my method. I have to respect the person that I'm channeling, their uniqueness, their brilliance, their intelligence. And I have to find my own way through that, and my own way of receiving that, and of interpreting it, and making these connections and correspondences, and bringing together disparate forms of knowledge and putting them in conversation. But it's it's like you say, it is tricky. It's definitely there are definite risks involved in doing that.
Yeah, and the part which I was kind of going back to Cason's first point is also being able to resist the idea to make those connections stick. They're in play, they're in the air, there is the idea that I think is also part of the method, or I don't know, but maybe it is part of a way of being where you don't tie them into neat arrangements. They're left to kind of rub against each other in different ways. So there's something around that aspect that I feel is interesting. One other quick question, which is just to go back to the idea, the term I confess, and the idea of faith in the title of the show. Like, how do we kind of understand that or decode it?
Well, okay, just to be perfectly honest, the title was, it was suggested to me by my brilliant partner, Jason Simon. We had both recently watched the Hitchcock film, I Confess, and which is this absolutely incredible film starring Montgomery Clift as a priest accused of murder. So it was just like, it's all performed by everyone else. All the other actors are Québécois. It's taking place in Quebec City in the 1950s, I think, right around the era when I grew up in Quebec. Maybe it was a tiny bit earlier. So it was just, I stole the Hitchcock title, but it transpired afterwards that I had a lot to confess, and it comes out in the film, and there was just like one other incredible coincidence, which was that so Montgomery Clift is this priest unjustly accused of murder, and then we have Pierre Vallières, who was also tried and convicted of murder and totally framed, and later, later freed. But yeah, there are a lot of coincidences like that in the film, kind of uncanny, and all the parts just kind of came together. It doesn't really have a proper ending, I have to say that. I really struggled with the ending. The ending is very, it's a bit of a non-ending. But I'm always ambivalent about endings. I never know if I should circle back, if I should do the classical ending, which I always find is a bit of a contrivance. It's not how things happen in life. Things don't happen perfectly like that. Things like don't. Endings, death is just like a cut, as Pasolini said. It's, this radical cut. So yeah, just I have this indecision and ambivalence about, should I wrap it up or should I just, leave it? And that's truer to life, to just kind of end it more abruptly and not in this circular fashion, which is it was just denying the viewer something, because it's inherently satisfying, to have a narrative that completes itself, that, returns to the beginning. And so it's, I don't know, maybe it's a bit sadistic.
But I think there's something like there's a richness in denying that satisfactory, and like it leaves an audience with something else, maybe, that is perhaps like more important or richer than a satisfying ending.
Just checking, are we to take questions now, or should we just continue? Emmy? Oh.
I think that we can probably start opening it up. We have one question from David Scriven, I guess primarily addressed to Moyra, but if anybody else would like to comment, if you've seen Robert Lepage's La Confessionnal, which mixes his story in with the filming of I Confess in Quebec City.
I did see it. I didn't know about it. I think it was Dalie, actually, who told me about it and loaned me the DVD. So yeah, I watched it after, pretty much after I had made the film, or towards the end. I didn't, I think I might have known about it, but I hadn't seen it. And it was, it was really interesting to watch that film and to see how he handled it. What he did with the Hitchcock, and
And Pradeep, it looks like we do have another 10 minutes, and I think much of the audience has just been happy to do a lot of listening and learning from the presenters tonight. So I'd be very happy to turn the conversation back to you, if you'd like to say some final words.
Instead of final words, I was just going to ask one question, and maybe of both Cason and Dalie and Moyra. Is that okay? Or do you guys want to say something else? Yeah. So Moyra, in the book, when you write to your friend Alison Strayer, do you code switch when you speak French? Do you speak differently when you're in Quebec and in Paris? Can you say something Dalie and Cason and Moyra about the multilingual imagination, French and English, the social and political implications of language, I mean, in some way.
Yeah, maybe I'll start off. My French isn't amazing. And so I probably have maybe like a 7th, 8th grade level. So I read the text originally in French, just to kind of feel my tongue around it. And then went back and read the English translations. And I think that something specific about the Quebec experience within Canada that I confess, I think articulated really nicely is that that linguistic divide will always cause a little bit of, like you will never know fully the full complexity and nuance of it if you're not engaged with that dialect specifically. And so I kind of pushed myself to read the French parts of this book because I felt it was, even though I didn't get all the nuances, I felt like there was something essential into just reading the words. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Agreed. Language is not just a set of tools to communicate. It's not transparent. It's not clean. It has a thickness. It's full of dirt. It's of unspeakable matter. So it carries history, of course, but class, gender, race, landscapes, territories, carries loss. And it would be too simple, I agree with that, to just oppose the French and the English worlds to make sense of political history in Canada, or even to add in there the numerous and complex Indigenous languages, of which many are still spoken on the territory today. So there are, under the notion of language, many realities, not only dialects and accents. Of course, there's that, but it's also eras, continents, stories, maps, people, and a more complex and rich and paradoxical vision of the Americas. So yeah. Not only do I code switch when I am in Paris, but within the same day, living my life in Quebec, I will use registers and indexes that are quite different depending on the interlocutor. If it's my grandmother, if it's a mechanic, if it's a room filled with art historians, or some guy my age living in the country, or a kid in Montreal, it's going to be different. So. And this is because the French language spoken in the Americas has been, for the most part and for the longest time, a oral thing. So it's all variation of the medieval Canuck patois Jack Kerouac talks about. And as a consequence, for most of native speakers like me, we deal with a significant diglossia, where, for instance, the French I speak, a Creole of sort, is very, very distant from the French I write, which is normative. And I think this is pretty important in understanding the old, what I call the subaltern imaginary of the French world in the Americas.
I actually, that expression code switching, I came across it when I was reading. It was somebody who was commenting on, what William Buckley, when William Buckley attacked Baldwin and said he had a fake English accent or something like that in the 1965 debate at Cambridge. And so I was reading a writer who was talking about how, exactly what Dalie was saying, how Baldwin could code switch. He could speak a certain way in Harlem, and he could speak, English a certain way in wherever in Europe. And he did that with a huge amount of ease. So that's actually where I kind of learned that expression, and I put it to my friend Allison, who learned French in Quebec, but then ended up moving to Paris and marrying a French guy. And I was just, really curious to know, like, how, if she spoke differently in Paris. I mean, I know she does. I know she lives with this guy, and she's, it's been 20 years or so, and so she, she's picked up, a French accent. But when she comes back to Quebec, she reverts to the Québécois lilt, as she calls it, and speaks like the so-called mother tongue, I guess, is a way that you could put it. And she's also a very funny person, and a really great mimic. And she makes fun of her Parisian husband. She makes fun of his accent, and it's absolutely hilarious. She exaggerates his French accent, all in a very kind spirit. It's not a mean-spirited thing, but it's. And she does it a little bit in I Confess. Also, she sort of takes on the persona of the school teacher when she speaks at one point.
I believe there's one more question.
So we're coming to the end, and it's almost 7, so I think it's quite appropriate for the final question to go back to the theme of circularity that was introduced by Cason. It's a question for Dalie. If theoretically there is no beginning or ending, what is the character to the extremes of the phases of repetition, and could they be arising from a lytic impulse?
I don't understand the question. How would you put it in other words? Or maybe you could read it again.
I'll read it one more time,
okay.
And perhaps the last bit. And it could you can interpret it in however you'd like to address what the characters of repetition could be for you. If theoretically there is no beginning or ending, what is the character to the extremes of the phases of repetition?
What is the character to the extremes of the phases of repetition?
Yes.
I don't know. I don't understand the question, sorry.
Well,
how do you understand it, Amy?
I'm not quite understanding the question really either. I'd have to think about it. But
Let's
I guess
think about it.
But to return to an openness and no beginning, to maybe close without closing.
Yes.
And feel free to jump in, Pradeep, to offer your closing words. I just wanted to say that like the book, we've gotten quite a lot of comments from people about just how powerful this conversation has been. And like the book, I don't think it's a conversation really meant to end, but at some point we stop.
That's it. That's this idea that it's ongoing, and we're all in there. We're all in this conversation.
Yes,
it's going through us, and no beginning and no end means that we're all involved.
Mm-hmm. And for me, what the book allows personally to go into my eye, in the I Confess, is a bridging of these histories of colonialism and power across our North American border, from this very American insularity, perhaps not dissimilar in the way encountering the passages from your shelf, Moyra, and your great process of reading, with that lack of prejudice, as Dalie spoke of, an openness and positioning oneself in that position of not knowing, right, while encountering these passages of Baldwin or Robert Frank's The Americans, from the perspective of being in Canada. And that's kind of the power of books. So just on behalf of Printed Matter, just go back to the book. Thank you, Dancing Fox Express, for that circularity too, of bringing it back to the book that doesn't have an end, a book that contains, but it's a book that contains an openness, that contains the questions. Thank you, Pradeep, Dalie, especially Moyra, for your work. Cason, and yeah, the work that allowed for this conversation, this convergences of excellent eyes. So, and I give the final word to you, Pradeep.
No, I don't really have much, but I will say one thing, Moyra, that in the process of just preparing a little bit for today, by looking at all of the different book projects, I think there is something around the way that you have insisted on a particular way of constructing these books and the way the ideas and the images work in them. They're different. You're improvising, you're changing, but yet when I look at them as a group, I realize that I think for artists, it's amazing how, however or wherever the idea is, it's the insistence on kind of driving it that then it becomes something. Anyway, so I was thinking about that, and I would encourage everyone to kind of get your hands on the earlier books and just really pay attention, because I feel that they are opening up a way of making and reading and thinking in a way that is not quite following any other path that I've seen. So,
it's my favorite way of working as an artist, frankly, making books.
It's fantastic for all of us. Thank you. Well,
Thank
you,
you.
Dalie. Thank you, Cason. Thank you,
Yes,
Moyra.
thank you, Dalie, Cason. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Pradeep, thank you.
Okay, bye.
See you
So we sign
soon.